You said that you rode the bike and instead of riding an ATV across it, were you worried at all about like looking like a dork instead of looking really, really cool?
I had one person who was driving along the edge who stopped and got out of their truck and looked at me and said, "You're a moron."
Hello, and welcome to the Bumpy Soup Podcast, a podcast with jokes drier than the Great Salt Lake. I'm Alec. I'm here today with Emily.
Yoo-hoo.
Aqua Supreme.
This is the first time we've done this.
And Dr. Kevin Perry.
Woo!
Hello.
Yeah.
So this is a bit of a special episode. We're going to be talking about the Great Salt Lake, and Emily is going to be giving a better introduction to Kevin in just a little bit. But first, we're going to kind of talk about why we're doing this episode. So, Aqua Supreme, you want to take it off?
Yeah. So we made a TikTok about the Great Salt Lake, having a bunch of arsenic at the bottom of it, which is just something I learned from my environmental science classes and through various readings online as a social media user. Anyways, but a lot of people responded with wanting more information or, saying, why is someone who doesn't know about this talking about this? So we're going to do our best to try to get some real information out there from someone who actually knows what they're talking about.
We don't get a lot of engagement on our TikTok videos usually, but this one popped off. We're sitting at like 220,000 views and a lot of comments. It's clearly something a lot of people care about, and we are average people. One of us is taking an environmental science class, but we wanted to go straight to the source, and that's why we have Kevin here today. Yep. Is there anything else you wanted to add before I jump into his introduction?
We like to pretend that we're smart, but we finally got an actual smart person to come talk to us. So we're going to give him the reins to give us the real answers, the truth about all of this, and we'll just try and ask good questions and all that stuff, be good students.
All right. So Professor Kevin Perry has been a faculty member at the Department of Atmospheric Sciences at the University of Utah for the last 21 years. He holds a BS degree in meteorology from Iowa State University and a PhD in atmospheric sciences from the University of Washington. He served as chair of the Department of Atmospheric Sciences for 7 years and has expertise in the broad areas of air pollution and atmospheric chemistry. For the last 6 years, his research has focused on the emission of dust from the exposed portions of the Great Salt Lake. During that time, he has spent more than 200 days conducting field work at the Great Salt Lake and has personally visited all 800 square miles of the exposed lake bed. Whew. He is currently serving as a member of the Great Salt Lake Strike Team, whose goal it is to synthesize existing scientific data and research for use by policymakers. In other words, Dr. Kevin Perry is far and away the biggest brained person we've ever had on our humble podcast. And we're so thrilled to have you on the podcast, Kevin.
Thank you.
No, absolutely. As a scientist, sharing what we do is really important, because if you do it and nobody knows about it, what's the whole point in the first place?
Good point.
Yeah. When I cold called Kevin at like 9 a.m. a couple weeks ago, he told me that you'd made a vow to never say no to an interview.
And I've been doing 2 to 3 interviews a week since I made that decision back in 2019.
Wow. Trying
to spread the word. And now when you talk to people in Utah, I mean, this is a topic that people want to talk about. It's a topic that people want to know more about. And I hope that I had some small part in actually helping to educate people and getting us to where we are today.
I think you certainly have.
Yeah, I think that the first time I learned about this was an article that featured you rolling around on your bike out on the Salt Lake bed. So it somehow got to us and probably a lot of people because of that. But we're going to make sure that you regret that decision to never turn down an interview. So.
Your curse is our blessing.
Well, I
Thank you,
must say
Kevin.
that, giving my age and giving your demographic, this is a good way to get into younger people's living room, so to speak. I was naive when I started doing the interviews. I thought if I did 5 or 10 interviews, I'd get to everybody. But everybody's media streams are so siloed that you've got to literally do hundreds of these in order to get into everybody's inbox.
That's a really good point. Yeah.
Well, thank you for what sounds like your labor of love, and we love Utah a whole lot and care about it. And so we're so happy that things have unfolded the way they have. We're obviously not happy about arsenic in the air, so we'll get to that in a little while. But I was thinking maybe we could start off with Kevin, you telling us a little bit about your journey and how you got interested in the Great Salt Lake and what your studies have looked like and some of your findings there.
Yeah, so I started studying dust about 30 years ago, which means that I'm older than most of the people watching this podcast now. And I was working for the National Park Service, and we were looking at the air quality in the national parks. And every summertime, there was a whole bunch of dust that started filling up the eastern part of the United States. And that's not a time period when it's windy. So we're like, where is this dust coming from? And we did some more research, and we found out that that dust was actually coming from Africa, across the Atlantic and into the eastern U.S.
Crazy.
And there's more dust in Texas in summer than there is from Africa than there is from anywhere in North America.
Wow.
And that just kind of blew me away.
Yeah.
And then,
That's
insane.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's crazy.
So that was kind of my first foray into dust sort of thing. And then, I moved up to Washington State, and I started noticing dust coming across the Pacific from the Gobi and the Taklamakan deserts in Asia. And I'm like, wow, this dust just goes everywhere. And so when I moved to Utah 21 years ago, I was doing, air quality research, trying to understand, what makes, certain things dangerous for people. And about 10 years ago, I started noticing dust plumes coming off the lake. And I'm like, okay, we've seen this picture before, and we've seen Owens Lake in California. We've seen other dry lakes dry up and blow dust. And I thought I had a unique skill set that might allow me to be able to, try and figure out if this was going to be a problem locally as well.
Wow. So, I mean, it sounds like so Africa and Asia have both been sending dust to America. Are we finally about to send dust back to them? Are we finally returning the favor?
Absolutely. When it comes to small particles in the atmosphere, they stay in the atmosphere until it rains, which is typically about 2 weeks. And in 2 weeks, our particles can be transported to Europe. Europe's can be transported to Asia. Asia can be transported here. And the whole like Finding Nemo thing, we're all swimming in the same shit bowl, basically.
Yeah. Nice. The shit bowl of air that we're in. Yeah.
Yep.
Well, cool. So what is it about the Great Salt Lake that kind of is now interesting you?
Yeah, so as the lake has been shrinking, it's exposed 800 square miles. Just to put that into perspective, I mean, that's like the same area as the island of Maui in Hawaii, and it's more than half the size of the smallest state in the United States, Rhode Island.
Oh, wow.
And this exposed lake bed, which we call playa, which I only just recently learned is Spanish for beach. I think, because I don't speak Spanish.
That's kind of a nice word for what's happening.
But we call it playa, and it just happens to be right close to where 2.5 million people live. And these dust plumes come off the lake, and they can literally be in people's backyards within 5 or 10 minutes. And that's what raises the concern, is because when these dust plumes move across, they can reduce the visibility to less than a mile. And they raise the particle concentrations to very high levels. And it's just not a pleasant environment to be in when the dust is blowing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that is that like kind of, does inversion up there add to that, or is that just kind of a...
No, so the temperature inversion is a wintertime phenomenon where the cold air is trapped in the valley and all of our local pollution is trapped as well. But that's also a time period when the winds are calm and it's typically wet during the winter. So it's not like the dust is going to overlap with our already poor air quality in the winter. We have air quality challenges in the winter. We have air quality challenges in the summer with ozone and wildfire smoke. And the spring and the fall are typically good air quality time periods. But that's when the dust is most likely to occur, when we have strong cold fronts. And so what the dust is threatening to do is to turn us into a region, instead of having seasonal air quality challenges, could theoretically have year-round air quality challenges.
Oh, okay. Awesome.
So we wanted to ask about like the water level. So you're saying that like 800 feet have been exposed. And like basically what is the future trajectory of that and what are the causes of that?
Yeah, so the lake has been shrinking for 25 to 30 years now, and it's been doing so at an alarming rate. And everybody always asks me, is this due to climate change or is this due to the drought? And those are contributors to the problem. But the overwhelming reason why the lake is shrinking is that we just use too much darn water. We actually use 30% too much water. And where do we get that water from? We siphon it out of the streams that feed into the Great Salt Lake before the water makes it to the lake. And that's primarily the Bear River, the Weber River, and the Jordan River. And when we siphon off that much water, it means that if we have 100% normal snowpack, that the lake will shrink. We have to have 130% of normal snowpack just for the lake not to shrink. Now this year, we've got 167%. We've got a record snowfall. So the lake is going to rise. Woohoo!
So that's going to fix all of our problems,
you
right?
You can't expect the lake to survive if we have to have 130% of normal. So the lake's been shrinking. There was a study that just came out from Ben Abbott at Brigham Young University who basically alarmingly said that the lake will be gone in 5 years if we don't do anything. And that's just bunk. As the lake shrinks, it gets saltier and saltier, and salt water has a much harder time evaporating. So the evaporation rate is going to decrease, and we're always going to have a lake out there of some sort. What they really should have said is if we don't do anything different, the lake as we know it, with being the vibrant ecosystem supporting millions of birds and the brine shrimp industry, that lake could be gone in 5 years if we don't do anything.
Decreasing further than where the levels are right now, like how much smaller do you think the lake is going to get? Like to be, I mean, like it won't be able to sustain these birds anymore and stuff like that. Like how much smaller is it going to get?
So it's not necessarily the size of the lake that controls the ability to feed the birds. It's actually the salinity, but the salinity and the lake size are related. So as the lake gets smaller, you're concentrating that salt in smaller volume, and the concentration goes up. And this last October, the salinity in the southern part of the lake got to 19%, which is just like right on the hairy edge of where the brine shrimp and the brine flies can barely survive. And the brine shrimp and the brine flies are the base of the food chain, and they're what feed all the birds. So what I noticed in October was that the brine flies were missing. They were just gone. I've never seen that before. There are usually just millions and millions of these along the shore, and there's so many of them that the birds literally just open their mouths and run through them, and they can't miss. They just can't miss. You open your mouth and you got bugs in it. And this year, they were just gone. And the birds that would normally feed on those were also gone because they're looking for food elsewhere. And we came right up to the toe of that ecological collapse. And the good snow year this year is great. It's going to buy us a year. And the state legislature also did something else that'll buy us some more time. And that is they raised a berm between the northern and the southern parts of the lake. And now it's two separate lakes. And all of the water from the snowpack that's going to come down the rivers, the Bear River, the Weber River, and the Jordan River, they all feed into the southern part of the lake. And so by sacrificing the northern part of the lake, we can reduce the salinity in the southern part of the lake. And so we got really close to the tipping point, but we bought ourselves a year or two with this snowpack and the actions taken by the legislature.
Okay, so basically from like an ecological point of view, the salinity of the lake is the most important thing. And is the southern part just more home to more life there, or compared to the north?
Yeah, so the northern part of the lake is basically salt saturated. It's like 26 or 27% salt, and that's too salty for the brine shrimp or the brine flies, and so there's no food. And so the only thing that lives up there is some crazy little, bacteria sort of thing that turned the water pink. And that pink color of the water is basically a sign that it's not very productive. Now, there are birds that live up there. There are pelicans that live up on Gunnison Island. And then they fly, 50 or 100 miles sometimes to go get fish and then come back. But they like to live on the island because it had been an island which protected them from the coyotes. But as the lake shrank, now the island is connected to the land, and the coyotes can go out there and harass them all they want to.
So are you saying between a fight with a coyote and a pelican, a coyote would win? Like, what percentage of the time?
Well, the pelicans are really kind of shy. And so it's not so much that the coyotes are taking on a full-grown pelican, because the pelican can do a pretty good job of defending itself.
Okay.
The baby pelicans can't. But mostly the coyotes are out there after eggs and really small chicks, because after that it gets a little bit of a fight between the two, and neither one of them really want to partake in that.
I see. Have you considered that maybe this is good for the coyotes?
So you would think so for that aspect, but the coyotes feed on the birds. And when the birds are missing, the coyotes are out there wandering around going, where can I find some food? So the coyotes struggle too, sort of thing. Although temporarily, as the birds die, there's lots of them to feed on. But shortly after that, the bird numbers will just be too small for the coyotes to comfortably survive on.
I see. Okay.
I'll tell you what, one of the things about working in the role that you do is all this information. You're up to date on like how scary it is. I feel like I would be terrified if I go and I just don't see any brine flies anymore. I know that when I've gone to Antelope Island, you're swatting them away all the time. If they're just not there, it'd be like,
Yeah, so the wildlife biologists have been watching the trend on the Great Salt Lake for the last 20 years, and they've been sounding the alarm about what the trajectory for the lake was. But people didn't really seem to care much about the birds, and it didn't really resonate with the public. And what really resonated with the public was when they could see these dust plumes coming off the lake, and they wondered, what the heck am I breathing? Because it's depositing on my cars, it's depositing in my garden, it's coming in my house, it's giving a layer of dust inside my house. How unhealthy or potentially unhealthy is this? And that's really what got people's attention. Yeah.
Yeah, so I didn't know anything about what a hotspot or lake crust was. I've maybe heard of that like in passing, but I didn't know much about it until I watched I think it was an interview you did for a class at Westminster. Do you want to talk a little bit about your time like on the lake bed collecting samples, and then talk a little bit about crust and what a hotspot is and why it's important?
Sure. Yeah, so when I started going out to the lake 7 years ago, like a lot of Utahns, I hadn't spent much time out there at all. And I didn't really know what to expect. I didn't know where the dust was coming from. I didn't know that there was a lot of surface crust out there. I didn't know anything, basically. And I learned by going out there and observing. And at first, I decided to do this by bicycle. Because one, it's illegal to ride ATVs on the lake bed without a special permit, and the ATVs do a lot of damage to the surface, and I didn't want to damage whatever it was I was going to be studying. And the other thing is I used to be an avid bicycle rider, and when you do a bike ride, you notice everything along the way, because you're moving at a smaller rate of speed. When you're traveling your car at 80 miles an hour, or an ATV at some other ridiculous speed, like people do in Utah, you just fly by things and you don't notice it. And so what I quickly realized is that all my preconceived ideas about the lake bed were completely blown out of the water. So a lot of people think that you're going to go out there and it's going to look like the Bonneville Salt Flats, that it's just going to be a salt crust everywhere as far as you can see. And that's not what the Great Salt Lake bed looks like. There's only like 3% of the lake bed that's even covered with salt like that. But it's more like going to the beach where you have a lot of sand, and mixed in that sand, you have salt crystals. And so as you look across it, you'll get sun glints from the salt crystals that are on the surface. Now, what's different about the Great Salt Lake bed from the beach is you go to the beach and there's no crust. And so walking is really hard. And imagine trying to ride a bike across the beach. It's just not very much fun. But luckily, about 75% of the lake bed has a physical crust right on top. And I've got an example here. This is a really thick piece of crust.
Wow, yeah.
And it's kind of like a dinner plate.
Oh, man.
And only about 4% of the lake bed is covered with this really thick type of crust. Most of the crust is actually kind of no thicker than like a few sheets of paper. It's a really thin crust. But even that thin crust is sufficient to prevent the wind from accessing the small particles in the dirt. And so that crust is our friend. And I quickly learned that. And I decided to do my sampling by bicycle in part because the access is hard, the distances are far, and I ended up riding 2,300 miles on the lake bed over a period of 26 months to go out there and visit.
How are your calves doing?
Are they ripped?
It was funny because I was at a Five Guys one time, shameless plug, and
Shout out.
This person came up to ask me, what did you do to get those calves? And I'm like, oh, nothing. It's genetics. And he's just looking at me. No, I said I rode thousands of miles on the bicycle, and he's like, oh, never mind.
Nice. Yeah, no. So you rode this bike, and I'll put a picture up here of the bike that you rode. It's kind of like a trike, right?
Yep.
With like a cool thing on the back. And so a question I had about that, you said that you rode the bike and instead of riding an ATV across it, were you worried at all about like looking like a dork instead of looking really, really cool?
I had one person who was driving along the edge who stopped and got out of their truck and looked at me and said, "You're a moron." At the time, I was stuck in the mud trying to get my bicycle out of the mud, and I kind of had to agree with him that, I went a little too far. I was in the mud, and I needed to get out of there, and it wasn't very fun. But I didn't appreciate being called a moron either while I was doing it.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for sacrificing yourself to the mud for the cause. Yeah.
So ATVs are not great for the crust then. And you have
so
to have a special
ATVs,
permit
four-wheel drive trucks, there's a lot of illegal activity out there, and it does a lot of damage to the playa, which only just increases the likelihood of it being a dust source. Right now, only 9% of the lake is acting as a dust source. And that's a combination of that crust and the fact that there's just a lot of sand out there. If you go to the beach and grab a handful of sand and throw it up in the air, it just comes right back down. It doesn't blow away because the particles are too big. Now, if you mix a whole bunch of small particles, silt and clay, with that sand, and now you grab it and throw it up, the sand particles will still fall right back down, but the small particles will blow away. So those small particles, where do they come from? Well, they come from the Bear River, the Weber River, and the Jordan River. So the places where those rivers enter into the lake have higher concentrations of this material that can blow away as dust. And so the entire lake bed is not equally able to be a dust source, sort of thing. So,
and the places that they enter, those are closer to basically where civilization is, right? Where humans are living. Right.
So those rivers flow right through the cities and end up right into the lake bed, just west or north of the cities, sort of thing. So, yeah.
Okay. Wow. We've talked about how there's heavy metals like arsenic in the lake, and arsenic is the scariest sounding one. But we've kind of heard a couple different places. Is that naturally occurring, or is that a result of pollution or runoff?
Yeah, so before I went out there, we had no idea what was in the dust. And so I was basically on an expedition to see what was out there. And so I collected soil samples every 500 meters over the entire 800 square miles, which is more than 5,000 soil samples. Whew. And I brought them back to the laboratory, and I dried them, and I sieved them, and I pulled out the small particles, the ones that actually end up in your lungs. And then I measured the chemical composition of that. And through a variety of techniques, I was able to quantify 53 different elements. And then I've got these measurements. Well, what does it mean? Well, I compared it to standards that were put forth by the Environmental Protection Agency. And they're called regional screening levels. And basically what they do is they figure out, how toxic is this element? And okay, arsenic is pretty toxic. So you don't have to have a really large dose in order for it to be dangerous. So they figure out what's the maximum dose that you could receive in order for the cancer rates to still be less than 1 in a million. And so they establish these screening levels. And so if the concentrations you measure are less than the screening levels, then it's considered safe. And if the concentrations are greater than the screening levels, then it's potentially unsafe. And you need to do more measurements to find out what the dose is that people are actually receiving. Because we don't know how much arsenic is actually being transported to the surrounding communities because we don't have the measurements. And there were 9 elements that were greater than the regional screening levels, but by far arsenic was the one that I was most concerned about because every single measurement that I took of arsenic was more than 10 times higher than the regional screening levels from EPA. And so, it raises the concern level, obviously. But, the New York Times article from last summer really did a hatchet job on my research. And they're talking about the toxic dust and everybody's scared. And I get people calling me up going, should I move out of the state? Do I need to wear a gas mask? And the answer is no. And I'll get into that in a little bit later in our conversation. Okay. But we do have a potential toxic element out there that we need to do more research on to find out how often is it transported to the surrounding communities? What are the concentrations when it gets there? And what fraction of it is bioavailable, can even interact with your lungs? Because if it's locked up in some mineral, it really won't interact with you. And we don't know those answers yet. So when I talk about arsenic, I talk about a contaminant, a potential concern, and I'm doing the follow-up research to try and figure out if it's a real concern or not.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
So the EPA limit for arsenic, that's for cancer, right?
Yeah. So if you are exposed to arsenic-laden dust for a long period of time, typically speaking longer than a decade, then it increases your risk of lung cancer, skin cancer, bladder cancer. It can raise incidence of diabetes and can also lead to cardiovascular disease. But it's primarily the lung cancer that we're most worried about.
Okay.
If I eat a little bit of arsenic every day, will I build up my tolerance?
Sprinkle it on there.
Yeah. Just put some
You'll preserve yourself 6 feet under the ground. That's for sure.
So is that arsenic then naturally occurring, or is that something that's been deposited because of pollution?
So that's a good question. So if you had a industry or a mine that was the source of the arsenic, you would expect the arsenic to be really high concentrations around that plant or around that discharge area. And we refer to those as point sources of things. And there are a lot of elements out on the lake bed that show that we have sources like that. Copper is really high on the southern shore of the Great Salt Lake, right next to the tailings pile from the Kennecott copper mine. Lead is really high in Farmington Bay because of all of the gasoline that people used to burn that had lead in it, and those turned into particles that got into the water supply and then ended up down in the lake bed. But the arsenic concentrations were very uniformly distributed over the entire lake bed, which tells me that, yes, there may be some industrial sources, but it's primarily a naturally occurring element because it's been deposited slowly, evenly over the entire lake bed for hundreds or thousands of years. And it didn't surprise me that we had high concentrations of arsenic because that's very common in these lake beds in the western U.S. So I was expecting to see arsenic. I was just a little surprised that the concentrations were higher than some of the other lake beds that had been measured in the West.
Okay, so do you think that's like just ash deposits from like hundreds of thousands of years ago, and that's just where that's come from then?
So the rivers are cutting down the mountains and eroding, and it just tells me that the rocks in Utah where these rivers are coming through are naturally a little bit higher in arsenic.
Okay.
And so as that erosion happens, it just slowly moves those arsenic minerals down towards the lake and where they deposit. And since it's a terminal basin lake, everything that makes it to the lake stays there unless it blows away. So, all of the sewage and all of the other nasty things that we put into the lake are still out there. They're just buried underneath the sediment from the rivers that come in.
Okay, so we can't blame anyone except for the earth itself for our arsenic problem. Okay.
But, theoretically, it wouldn't be an issue if all of that arsenic were underwater.
Yes.
Right, there we go. There we go. All right, we can blame someone again. I love it.
Speaking of which, do you want to talk about water?
Yeah.
Water use?
So you said that the snowmelt would normally cover, but we need more than 30% of the normal snowmelt. So why do we need that? Like, where is the water going that would normally be going into the Great Salt Lake?
Yeah, so as scientists, we use really strange units sometimes. And the way we describe the volume of water is in a strange unit called an acre foot. So you basically have 1 acre of land and you put 1 foot of water on it, and that's an acre foot of water. Okay. We divert 2 million acre feet of water a year from the Bear River, the Weber River, and the Jordan River for other purposes. And about 2/3 of that water is used for agriculture. About 10% is used for cities. 10% is used for industry, and there's another 8 or 9% that's used for the mineral extraction industry. And then there's some losses of water that go into like Willard Bay impoundment, some reservoirs, and we lose water from those sort of thing. But primarily, most of the water is going to agriculture. And of that water that's being used for agriculture, more than half of the agricultural water is being used to grow alfalfa and hay, which feed cattle. And a lot of that alfalfa and hay from Utah is being shipped out of the state, and some of it's even being shipped out of the country. So we're essentially using Utah water to help feed the world.
Right on.
Killing Utah in the process. Let's go.
Fortunately, we don't need that water, so it's all good.
So as far as, do you think that, because I've heard this thing about alfalfa farms, do you think that that is justified that we're putting that much water into agriculture, or do you think that Utah probably shouldn't be putting that much money in there or water in
I don't know about you, but I like to eat.
Right.
And I haven't changed to being a vegetarian yet. I still enjoy my steak, which means that the cattle need to eat something. And the population is only growing, so our need for farming is only going to increase over time. So I don't think we can vilify farming here. I just think we need to think about how we can deliver water more efficiently to the farms. And ultimately, we have to figure out if we can grow the same amount of crops that we're currently growing in the desert environment that we live in. For example, down in Arizona, I just learned this recently, they're growing cotton down in the desert using water from the Colorado River. Well, yes, you can do that, but should you be doing that?
Mm-hmm, yeah.
And that's another conversation that the legislators don't seem to be willing to have right now, is they're trying to do the easy things. How can we be more efficient without asking the tough questions of should we be doing this at all or to what extent?
Right. Yeah, one thing that I've heard is that when it comes to water rights for farmers is that one is that they're not really metering it and knowing exactly how much. And two is that there's not really incentive for them to use the amount that they need. They overwater because it's a use it or lose it system. Is that correct?
So it used to be correct. Things have changed. The state legislature and the governor made a lot of sweeping changes to the laws 2 years ago, and the use it or lose it is now gone. So farmers have the option, if they're not going to use their water, they can basically lease it out to somebody else, or they can donate it downstream to the Great Salt Lake, or they can even sell it if they really want to, without And before, the way the law was set up, they had to use every single drop of their water right. Otherwise, they were at risk of losing that. And the water rights are actually pretty valuable to the farmers. And so that law has been changed. And now the incentivizing from the state legislature is they're putting a lot of money in this. The state legislature spent $250 million to put meters on a lot of the canals, so that we can better track the water and see what people are actually using. And they've also invested $250 million in agricultural optimization, which basically means figuring out how to get water to the crops without losing so much to the atmosphere in the air in the process. And so you can use less water and get the same amount of crops. And we anticipate that by these investments, we can actually reduce the agricultural water use by 15 or 20% and still grow the same crops.
Wow.
Now, that's not going to get us to where we need to be, but it's a big step in the right direction.
Yeah, that seems like, maybe the most obvious sort of solution that you should be doing in that spot. But what else can be done in those areas to help send more water to the Great Salt Lake or use it more efficiently?
Yeah, so one of the things that's going on in the cities is more than half of the water that's used in cities is used for outdoor irrigation, basically keeping lawns green. Who thought that growing Kentucky bluegrass in the desert was a good idea? I have no idea. They should be run off the planet. We live in the desert. We should not be growing grass because it takes an incredible amount of water. And just give an example. A few years ago, before I got rid of a lot of my grass in my yard, I tried to figure out how much water my neighbors were actually using to grow their grass. And so I set up my timers to be on the exact same schedule as they were. And my household, normally uses 5,000 gallons of water a month. And in this experiment, I found out that my neighbors were using 50,000 gallons of water a month in order to water their grass, which is 10 months of water that I would normally use in my household. And that was just for 1 month.
Wow.
It floored me.
Yeah, but did their lawn look better than yours?
Yeah, it did, actually.
Yeah.
So I kind of gave up on that game and have gradually been reducing the amount of grass that I have in my yard. But it's a hard thing to do. It's expensive, and you have to know what you're doing to try and put in the right kind of plants or something. I mean, I've seen people that just pour gravel in their front yard, and I like the sentiment, but it looks like crap. And there's a good way to do it and a bad way to do it, and I'm trying to do it a good way to make my yard look good, but reducing the amount of water that I need for my yard, because all of that water that's used outdoors, most of that is lost from the system.
Right.
So it's wasted water, basically.
And
the farmers don't want to spend all this money on conservation if the people in the cities aren't going to be doing the same thing, because we're all Utahns, we're all in this together. We all want to see people making similar sacrifices to try and save the Great Salt Lake.
Right.
So you think when you're talking about like replacing your garden and stuff, I mean, I just see a lot of stuff about people saying like have like a more natural yard, natural plants, and like biodiversity and stuff. Is that kind of what you're talking about? And that
Native
will help
plants.
with water?
Well, you tell me what St. George looks like. I spent very little time in St. George. Do people have green lawns in St. George, or do they have more of a natural landscape?
Yes.
They do. Yeah, it's all green yards down here.
Well,
It's all what?
It
Green
depends.
yards.
It depends. Some
Green yards.
Some HOAs have xeriscaped lawns. Some areas of St. George have green lawns.
There's a lot of grass down here, though.
There is a lot of grass, and there's a lot of grass that is like just maintained by the city that no one like uses too, like
Right.
Yeah.
which is so puzzling to me. I know that there's been pressure put on city officials to like change that to native plants, but that is Go ahead.
Yeah, this is one of the areas where it's really interesting that Las Vegas is doing a way better job than we are at how they landscape and how they use their water, sort of thing. Phoenix does a great job too, sort of thing. You don't see green lawns in Phoenix, and we need to change the culture of Utah so that we're not just perpetuating that needless use of water up here as well.
Absolutely. So St. George kind of has its own water issues. It seems like we feel a little bit separate from Northern Utah. Is anything that we're doing down here contributing to the Great Salt Lake related stuff, or are they their own separate issues?
It's all completely separate. So I hate to tell you this, but the Great Salt Lake problem can be solved because the bulk of the water that we've been using for the Great Salt Lake is within our control. We chose how to use the water. We can choose to use it differently, and we can value the lake, and we can put water back into it. down in St. George, you're reliant upon the Colorado River. And the Colorado River is losing water. It's a losing battle with climate change. And the climate models show that the Colorado River precipitation is going to decrease by 10 to 15% per decade for the next 100 years.
Wow.
And so you're just going to have to make do with less water each year.
Wow.
That's crazy.
I mean, what I heard there is that we don't need to change our behavior because it's not going to affect the Great Salt Lake. So we're free to, is that correct? We can just do whatever we want to.
Pray for rain.
Yeah.
You go right ahead until those big lakes down there are dry, and then you have no drinking water, and then we'll see what you do.
Yeah.
What
You'll be just like the Navajos that are currently trying to fight for water on the Colorado River, and it's really amazing to hear that 1/3 of the households there don't have running water, and that just is mind-blowing to me. It's actually criminal, I think, to not provide basic necessities to everybody in the U.S. So,
oh my gosh.
Wild.
Yeah. So, is it true that Utah? I mean, so I know that like magnesium companies use a lot of water, but do we sell our water to other states, and are other states supplementing our water?
No, not really. The Great Salt Lake, is a terminal basin lake. So by the time the water makes it down to the lake, it turns salty, and then it can't be used for a lot of what people normally think of as beneficial use. But the things that they do is they nice, the things that we actually pull from the lake, other than the doo-doo that was put there by the sewage treatment facilities over the last 150 years, they pull out metals. And salts. So they take water from the lake and they put it in evaporation ponds, and then they evaporate the water. It goes back to the atmosphere, and they mine the road salts. There's a little bit of table salt that's pulled out of there. And then there's a company called US Magnesium that pulls out magnesium metal. And that's used in a lot of different things. It's used in aluminum. It's used in aerospace. It's a strategically important metal. And now they're starting to mine lithium from the lake as well.
Oh, wow.
And lithium is a key ingredient in the batteries that we all use in our phones and in our cars and those sorts of things. And the world supply of lithium needs to be augmented in order to meet the needs of a electrified transportation sector, sort of thing. So.
The evaporation ponds, like just the process of extracting minerals is interesting to me, and like I know that it doesn't it's not as high of a percentage of water use as other sources, but it makes me wonder, like, are there extraction processes that don't include evaporating the water?
You can, but evaporation is by far the cheapest way to do it. And let's face it, road salt is not that productive. It doesn't cost much for road salt. And so it's not a process that becomes profitable if you have to put more energy and more money into the process of extracting it. So just using the sun to evaporate the water is the only thing that really makes it profitable. And so that's how they go about doing that.
Is that environmentally good? Like, it seems is it bad to be evaporating it, or is that fine?
They remove millions of tons of salt from the lake every single year. And that salt, if it were left in the lake, would contribute to the salinity problem that we have. So by removing the salt, they're actually reducing the salinity of the lake and making it, more able to support the brine shrimp and the brine flies.
Okay.
So they do a service, but they also shrink the lake by evaporating water. But the amount of water that they evaporate is only about 8 or 9% of the human consumption of water, sort of thing, and it contributes about $1.3 billion to the economy of northern Utah. So you always have trade-offs on these sorts of things.
Right, of course.
So with you, what you were just describing with the evaporation and stuff, it sounds like the commercial interests out on the lake have they've kind of been discussing this and it seems like they all kind of serve a purpose that isn't all negative. Is that kind of does it seem like a lot of the Like, do the governments have a lot of role in saying companies need to make sure that they're not destroying the lake if they're using that stuff?
Well, it's in their own interest not to destroy the lake. So let's talk about the brine shrimpers. So every November through January, they're out there in their boats, collecting the brine shrimp cysts, which are basically kind of the egg sacs from the brine shrimp. And then they collect those, millions of pounds of that, and they ship it off for aquaculture. In a lot of it primarily Asia, fish farms, prawn farms, and then that seafood comes back to us later on, sort of thing. If the lake gets too saline, then the brine shrimp spend all of their efforts shedding salt, and they don't reproduce. And that's clearly not in their interest either. And a lot of people think, well, don't the mineral extraction companies like it when the lake gets saltier because it makes it easier to get the minerals? Well, the problem is that when the lake gets low, the canals that they use to get water from the lake to their facilities become high and dry. And then they have to spend millions of dollars to dig those deeper and further. And some of those canals are already more than 4 miles long just to try and get out to the water.
Wow.
And the expense just keeps getting greater and greater to try and get water to those plants.
So a lot of commercial interests then kind of work in tandem to like help in some way with, like, it seems like they would be incentivized to help if there were programs that were set up.
Yeah, so I would agree that the industry, wants to be part of the solution and not part of the problem. But right now, Compass Minerals is making a huge sacrifice to save the lake. They only get their water from the northern part of the lake. And when they agreed to let the state cut off the northern part of the lake, there's no more water flowing in the north part of the lake. And if that persists for very long, their canals are going to be high and dry, and they're not going to have access to water. So that's a risk that they're taking. They're assuming that this, berm that they put in place to separate the lakes is a temporary measure, and that will get better with conservation. And so they can reopen that and let water flow into the northern lake again fairly quickly within a year or two.
Oh, that's cool.
Oh, wow.
So is Kennecott involved in this all? You kind of talked about how some of the minerals from what they're doing will flow off into the lake. Are they as big as the alfalfa or the U.S. magnesium?
So Kennecott does use water, sort of thing. I don't know how much water they use, but I do know that they were the first company to donate water to the Great Salt Lake. So they donated 20,000 acre feet of water a year for a period of 10 years with the intention of making that permanent at some point. So we need to increase the amount of water that flows to the Great Salt Lake by 300,000 or 400,000 acre feet. So 20,000 acre feet is only 5% of that, but it's a real amount of water that's making it to the lake. And so they've been good stewards that way. And they also are responsible for managing the inland shore shorebird reserve, which is basically a shorebird sanctuary on the southern shore of the lake. They donated the land for that and have helped rebuild some of the wetlands there on the southern part of the lake as well. So they're trying to be good stewards, but they do use a lot of water, as do a lot of industries, but they produce billions and billions of dollars of revenue and thousands of jobs for Utahns as well. And of course, the LDS Church just last week donated an additional 20,000 acre feet of water permanently to the Great Salt Lake. And so you add those two together, and that makes up almost 8% of what we need to do in order to stop the lake shrinking, from those two donations.
Yeah, that's actually that's pretty positive. That's one of the more positive things we've said on this podcast. That's actually pretty good. Yeah.
What is the LDS Church doing with their water currently? What do they use it for?
So they have a lot of farmland that they are basically in charge of. They do a lot of grazing, cattle, sheep, that sort of thing. And they were doing that on the southern shore of the Great Salt Lake, and they moved that operation elsewhere. Weren't going to use that water anymore for that operation. And so they decided to set a good example and donate that to the Great Salt Lake.
I see.
Awesome.
Yeah, that is good to know. I saw that article. I didn't read it though. My mom sent it to me. So maybe we can shift over to like impact and future impact with the Great Salt Lake. We've talked
Sure.
a little bit about like health risks with arsenic and like habitat loss, brine shrimp, brine flies. I'm curious what you think about like how far reaching the impact of losing that habitat and dust clouds. Like how far does this problem reach? It doesn't sound like it's just Salt Lake Valley that would be impacted. Like based on what you said about, dust, covering the earth. I'm curious what you...
So when the lake started shrinking, we hit a whole bunch of different tipping points. The first tipping point was dust production. The lake got low enough and it exposed enough of the lake bed that we started getting dust plumes coming off the lake. And the larger particles only stay in the atmosphere for a few hours. So those are the ones that are impacting the local communities, everything from Tremonton to Ogden, all the way down to Bountiful, Salt Lake City, Tooele, even Utah County. Are impacted by those because you've got strong winds of 20 or 30 miles an hour. You've got particles that are staying in the atmosphere for a few hours. So you've got a range of 100, 150 miles where you're getting a pretty good impact being downwind from the lake. Those smaller particles can stay in the atmosphere for 2 weeks and they'll blow off into a different continent within 2 weeks. So we've got this dust that's coming off the lake. That was the first tipping point. The second tipping point was the loss of recreation. If you've ever been to the marinas on the Great Salt Lake, they look a little different than they did 15 years ago. They're high and dry now. There are no boats out on the Great Salt Lake. When I moved here 21 years ago, you go out to the Great Salt Lake and there would literally be 20 or 30 sailboats. And you could go on a dinner cruise out on the lake. And all of that is gone now because the marinas just don't have access to water. And the search and rescue people have trouble getting boats on the water. The brine shrimpers are having trouble getting their boats on the water. And so that's what we lost in terms of recreation. And now the industry was having trouble getting water to their plants. And the last part that we're the most scared about is the ecological tipping point where the salinity gets so high that the brine flies and the brine shrimp disappear. And if that happens, there are literally 10 to 12 million birds that come by the Great Salt Lake every year. They stop here expecting a full refrigerator, and like what I had in college, they get there and all they find is basically empty stuff or moldy pizza, and neither one of which is going to sustain me for very long.
I love shrimp. I would be so sad if I was a bird and got there and there was none.
If we just put a bunch of ramen in the lake, would that help all the birds?
Well, it's got enough salt in it, it might preserve them when they die. So
Right.
Oh,
At least we're going to last a while as corpses. That's great.
So, you've got all of these different impacts. You've got economic impacts. You've got impacts to the wildlife. You've got loss of recreation. And the thing that I've been working on, of course, is potential health impacts. And the arsenic is what's gotten a lot of the attention, but that's not the thing that I'm the most scared of. I'm actually more scared of the plumes that are coming off the lake. And I don't care what they're made out of. The concentrations of the particles are just high enough that they start to interfere with your lungs. And the people that are most affected are people with asthma, people with COPD, the children, the elderly. But when the concentrations get high enough, it impacts everybody that breathes it. Now, why am I not an alarmist? Well, luckily, these dust storms only last a couple of hours. And if we get to the point where we can predict them or warn people that the dust is coming, then they can shelter in their houses. The houses do a pretty good job of filtering out a lot of the particles. And if you are stuck outside, those dreaded N95 masks that we've all been wearing for the COVID epidemic, they do a really good job of, protecting you from the particles from the lake. So it's not like you can't protect yourself from these sorts of things, but it does take some knowledge to know what's going on in order to do that.
Yeah. I do appreciate that the optimistic view is a little dystopian, that we'll all have to shelter in our homes because dust is going to fly around and we're going to have to not breathe for a little bit. Is that how likely is that to actually be a reality?
So, well, let's put it this way. You already do this and you don't even know about it. So when the wildfires happened, 2 summers ago and completely filled up our valleys with smoke, did you go outside and go exercising outside in that smoke? No. It was just too nasty to do that. During the wintertime and the inversions, we have the clear the air days where they encourage us to basically drive less. So what does everybody do? They hop in their cars and drive to the ski areas, contributing to the pollution down below. And then they get up above the inversion and have a wonderful ski day. And then they're reluctant to come back down because as they're coming back down the mountain, you see the soup that you're about to drive back into.
They have to deal with the consequences of their actions, right? Yeah. Something we all try to avoid.
Yeah.
So, the wildfire smoke sticks around for weeks. The inversion stuff can stick around for weeks. By contrast, the dust only sticks around for a few hours. So in the grand scheme of things, it's just one more issue that we have to be concerned about in an area where we're already plenty concerned with air quality. So I got a question for you.
Yep.
Do you think that the air quality in Utah is getting better or worse?
Worse.
Yeah, everybody says worse. The air quality is actually getting much better.
Really?
So over the last 30 years, the concentrations of pollutants in the atmosphere have dropped significantly, and they continue to drop year after year. Why is that?
Yeah.
Well, it has to do with our cars, primarily. They're getting better fuel mileage. The whole change from the mechanical carburetor to the fuel injection was a huge increase in efficiency and a huge decrease in pollution coming from those vehicles. I used to see smoking vehicles on the highway all the time. You drive behind them and they're just blue smoke, everything. You don't see that so much anymore because the cars are just, better designed sort of thing. And then, we've stopped using coal for energy in much of the state. We've converted to natural gas. There are no coal-fired power plants in northern Utah anymore. They're all been converted to natural gas. And we're rapidly shifting away from fossil fuels to renewable energies. So there are solar farms that are popping up all over Utah. There are wind farms popping up all over Wyoming. And the fraction of energy that we're getting from renewables is increasing at an exponential rate. So I think, over the next, 30, 40 years, we're going to be able to completely get off of fossil fuels.
Wow.
And as we change from fossil fuel-based vehicles to electric vehicles, that's going to cut the pollution in Salt Lake Valley down by at least half. So I'm very optimistic about the air quality future for Utah. And it's not all the gloom and doom dystopian, that has been put out there in the press to try and do clickbait to try and get people's attention.
That's really cool to hear.
That's really encouraging. Yeah. I wish I could go back in time for when car engines were different and experience what an inversion in Salt Lake was like back then. Compared to now, is that something that they did
I just want to share a story about my first car.
Okay.
My first car was a 1979 Trans Am. It had a 406-inch cubic engine, could go from 0 to 60 in a ridiculous amount of time. And it was a lot of fun. And it got 9 miles to the gallon when I was driving it like that in the city. And I get 14 on the highway.
Yeah.
No safety devices. It was just fun to drive, but man, it was not good for today's society.
Yeah,
wow.
but was it cool?
It was cool. Yes.
Wow. So why does it feel like the air quality is getting worse? Is it because we're just more aware of
So there were so when I moved here 21 years ago, if you did a survey of what people cared about, number one is education. We've got to fund our education system. Ironically, despite that being the highest priority, we still spend less money per student than any other state in the country, including Alabama and Mississippi. Oof. I don't know how that's possible, but it's true.
Wow.
And, if you had, what else did people care about 21 years ago when I moved here? who knows? It was a wide variety of things. But there were some physicians in Salt Lake City that decided they wanted to educate the public about the linkages between air quality and health. And they had a 10-year plan to do this. And they decided they were just going to scare the heck out of everybody. And they were very effective at what they were doing. I did not like their methodology, but it worked. And within 7 years of when they started this campaign, people in Utah clearly understood the linkages between air quality and health. And so that people are very hypersensitive now to threats to air quality. And that's why people think that air quality is getting worse when it's actually getting much better.
Wow.
They're just more aware of the dangers.
So I guess the education, we did get educated just only on air quality, which
Fear mongering works.
Yeah. We had a scientist say fear mongering works. We got to use it now. We got to use it.
Well, I mean, the New York Times article that basically said we're on the verge of a nuclear Armageddon and we got toxic dust and everybody's going to have to wear gas masks and the city's going to become unlivable. Okay, it's fear mongering. It scared the heck out of people, but on the other side, it actually drastically increased the conversation and the awareness that people have of the issue.
Yeah.
But I've been spending my time walking people back from the precipice that no, we're not going to turn into this dystopian future of not being able to live here without permanent gas masks. But it did get everybody talking about the issues, which is, the larger issue is we just use too much darn water for where we live, and we need to rein that in. When it's a difficult thing to do.
Yeah, a very common comment we have seen on that video is, this is why I moved away from Utah, or this is one of the reasons
I want to move away, or I need to move away. Yeah.
And so like hearing you say this, it's you don't have to move away from Utah, folks.
So Utah is the fastest growing state. And St. George in Washington County is the fastest part of this that's growing in the state, sort of thing. Why do people want to move to Utah? Because it's a wonderful place to live. The people are great. The outdoor activities are unparalleled, sort of thing. We have the greatest snow on earth. All of these things are absolutely wonderful. And it would be a shame if my research actually contributed to people feeling that this wasn't a great place to live, because it really is. I moved here, I fell in love with the place, I'm never going to leave, sort of thing. I've raised my family here. I'm hoping my kids will raise their family here, sort of thing. And it's just, unfortunate that this narrative has been out there because it's a little bit far from the reality of what we're actually facing. We can't continue growing forever. There are limits to population in Western cities, and that limits are the availability of water. So here's the situation. The cities need to not use any more water than they're currently using, even though the population is likely to double by the time we get to 2060. And the only way we can do that is for everybody to use less water in their everyday lives. So that means that we need to put in, fixtures in your house that are low flow, and, try and improve the efficiencies and reduce our outdoor watering so that we can make water available for the other people that want to move here and live within our means. And so there are a lot of good reasons to conserve water, and not just to save the Great Salt Lake, but also to allow us to continue to grow. If people think that's a great thing. The state legislature certainly is in favor of growth because it keeps our taxes low.
Yeah.
And so with that, I mean, does that all come back to mostly just don't water your lawn as much? Is that what's going to reduce that amount of water use?
So like I said, 55% of the water that we use is for outdoor watering. So if you can reduce the amount of turf that you have, you can significantly reduce the amount of water that you're using outside. And almost all the water that you use inside makes it to the lake anyway. It goes back down the sewer system and it goes to the lake. So, reducing your indoor water, taking a 3-minute shower is not going to save the Great Salt Lake because that water just ends up in the lake anyway. So reducing your outdoor watering by 3 minutes makes a big difference because that's water that's not being lost to the system. And the reason to conserve inside is to make additional water available for people that move into the state.
Right.
Yeah.
The bubble baths are here to stay, y'all.
Yeah.
Yes.
We can still take the bubble baths. And so you said 55% of water usage in Utah is for outdoor, like
55% of the water that's used by the cities is used for outdoor water.
Oh, okay.
Oh,
So,
okay.
and you said that about 10%. So it's only about 5.5% of water usage in Utah is for like lawns. Is that correct?
That's right. And so if we killed every single lawn and had outdoor watering being illegal in the state, we would reduce our water usage by 4 or 5%.
Okay.
Which is not going to get us to the reduction of 30% that we need. But if we add that 2 or 3 or 4% on to what the farmers are doing, which is their 15 or 20%, we're getting closer to the break-even point.
Yeah.
But at some point, it gets hard. We're doing the easy things now.
Right.
And at some point, it just gets harder and harder to get those extra conservation things that we need. And so one of the things that we have to do is when we have a wet year like this, when we have lots of water, we need to make sure that in the wet years, we get it to the lake because we're going to have dry years when we can't conserve enough water to allow the lake to not shrink. And so we need to what we call leverage the wet years. Because they're few and far between, but they're really important because the lake has been losing 400,000 acre feet of water a year for the last 20 years. And you can't make that up in one good snow year. You can't make that up in 2 or 3 good snow years. It's going to take us a decade or maybe 2 to get ourselves out of this situation and save the Great Salt Lake. But there's a commitment to do it. And so I'm cautiously optimistic that Utahns will step up and do what's necessary at the city level, at the residential level, at the agricultural level. I think everybody's recognizing the problem, and this really good water year gave us another year or 2 for these conservation measures to start to kick in.
Yeah.
There were some interesting, there are just interesting solutions I've heard and read about to like help raise the level of the Great Salt Lake. One of them came up in the TikTok comments a lot, and it was building a pipeline from the ocean. What do you think about that?
Sure. I get phone calls all the time from people who think they have solutions for the Great Salt Lake. And I'll share some funny ones here in a minute. But building a pipeline, sure, you can do it. It's going to cost $150 or $200 billion.
Billion?
And
with a B?
Billion with a B. The pipeline has to be 13 and a half feet wide. You have to desalinate the water in Los Angeles before you send it up here because you can't put the salt water through the pipes because it corrodes the pipes.
And plus, we're trying to decrease salinity, right?
And you don't want to bring critters from the ocean up here anyway, sort of thing.
No sharks in the Great Salt Lake, please.
You could do it. There was also a thing that said, well, we should build a nuclear power plant out in the West Desert and use it to pump water up from the deep aquifer and put that water into the lake.
Yeah.
Can you do it? Yes, you can. It's going to cost billions of dollars. Conservation is cheap by comparison. You can spend $250 million and save 15% of the water. I mean, that's a really good bang for the buck.
Yeah.
But I have people who call me up all the time. I'll tell you some of the funny ones.
Yeah.
I had a person who said, evaporation is your enemy, so we need to shade the lake. I'm like, okay, what do you propose?
Yeah.
We could build a trellis over the lake, and then we can put ivy on top of it, and it'll shade the lake. And I'm like, do you have any idea what 800 square miles looks like?
But it'll look really pretty.
Yeah, it'll be beautiful. It'll be a nice garden.
Exactly,
Oh,
sort
wow.
of thing. So,
Wow.
and then I had another company who said that, we have this stuff that we can spray on the lake bed that will keep the dust in place. And I'm like, okay, they want to do it by trucks. I say, okay, that's a bad idea. You don't want to drive trucks out there. You'll destroy the playa. Okay, well, we can do it by airplane. I was like, well, what's the biggest area you've done by an airplane? They said 1 acre. I'm like, do you realize what 100 square miles looks like?
Yeah.
Yeah, wow.
You're probably one of very few people who knows what that much distance feels like to bike over.
Yeah.
Lots of people in the comments on our video feel like Utah politicians are failing to act on this. Based on kind of what we've talked about with some of what the companies are doing and stuff, it sounds like there have been some actions taken to help with that. But outside of voicing concern, what actions do you think that just normal people could do to put pressure on politicians to do the right thing? And what would those look like?
Yeah, so the state legislature has changed the laws so that we can actually get water to the lake. And companies can donate water to the lake now legally, where they couldn't do that 2 years ago. So that's all been good improvements. The state has been investing in secondary water metering and agricultural optimization to try and reduce the amount of water that agriculture uses. They raised the berm, and cut off the northern and southern part of the lakes as an emergency measure. So they're doing these things. What they're really trying to do, but didn't actually accomplish this year, was to change the behavior inside the cities. So because each area of Utah is controlled by a different water conservancy district, and they all have their own rules and regulations. And one of the things that I really would have liked to have seen was a statewide mandate that says that all new construction has to consider their water footprint in the planning of the new construction. Because when you put in the landscaping for new construction, it locks in the water footprint for decades, because it's very expensive to swap out landscaping in the future, sort of thing. And I'd like to see building codes changed to where they minimize water footprints and encourage low flow showers and toilets and other sorts of things. And ultimately trying to get rid of non-functional turf, that NFTs as they're called.
Both are
if the
useless.
if the only time you walk on the grass is to mow it, get rid of it.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
So that's interesting. You're saying that, if you put in like a couple trees, you're locked into watering those trees until they die, right? That's kind of what you're saying, is in they need to consider what type of landscaping they're putting in.
Right. And so do you use grass, or do you use native plants that have a much lower water requirement? And a lot of it's just education. I didn't grow up in the desert. I don't know what native plants look like. Red Butte Garden up here at the University of Utah is a great place to go and learn about more different kinds of native plants. And some of them are really pretty, and they bloom, and they have flowers and those sorts of things. And you can get away with a lot less water if you just don't go to the box stores of the world that mass produce the different kinds of things that everybody sees and everybody has in their yards. You actually have to work a little harder to figure out what the native plants are, and dig a little deeper to find places that can actually provide those to you.
Wow.
Yeah. I have some news for you, Kevin. Today we have a large grass yard at the house we're at. And there are landscapers coming today to move our sprinklers in, and we're putting in beds, which I'm hoping native plants will go in eventually. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I did my backyard 2 years ago. I'm doing my front yard this year, sort of thing. So it's a lot of work.
It is.
I made my money in college as doing landscaping stuff, so I figure I can do it myself. And I'm still young enough. It's hard work, but it's good. It's good work, sort of thing.
Yeah.
So.
Mm-hmm. Something I wanted to mention, you had said that until 2 years ago, it was illegal to, now people can legally donate to the Great Salt Lake. Were people illegally donating to the Great Salt Lake? And were they wearing burglars outfits and running buckets
Throw
of
the water in
water?
Well, trust me, there were people in the state that think that every drop of water that made it to the Great Salt Lake was wasted.
Really?
There was that mentality. And so they were very unhappy, when we tried to implement change that would encourage more water to make it to the Great Salt Lake. But it was the people that started causing a ruckus and calling up their legislators and demanding action that have changed the opinion. And I don't think you find many people up on the legislature anymore who basically think that the water going to the Great Salt Lake is a waste. They just want to figure out how to save the lake without changing our current way of life, which is always a hard thing to do.
Yeah.
We'd love to solve climate change, but I don't want to get rid of my giant SUV. So what can I do?
Yeah.
Change it to electric, and then we'll be well on our way, and generate that electricity through renewable energy.
Yeah.
And then you're doing better. Sort of thing.
It's really
you still
cool,
have
actually.
a carbon footprint for the manufacturer, but you're doing way better than the gas guzzling giant SUV that people seem to like so much.
I like how there's kind of a full circle thing with lithium mining happening out of the lake, and our conversation about like renewables and that's a cool theme.
So you mentioned the having to basically have a water footprint figured out for new construction. What other legislative action could be taken to help with this?
So one of the things that they could do is they could establish a healthy range of lake elevations with triggering mechanisms when we fall below the healthy range of actions that could be taken on an increasingly emergency basis as the lake gets lower and lower. That's something that they could have done. They could also, mandate that all cities have to not draw any more water in the future, and that would drastically improve people's would increase the focus on conservation. If you have to live within your water means, then that would, encourage conservation if you want to continued growth. And they chose not to do that because they don't want to limit growth. In fact, one of the things that is still on the table is a thing called the Bear River Water Development Project, which would divert an extra 200,000 acre feet of water from the Bear River. They have plans to do this in the future. They have the land already mapped out. They're currently buying the land to build the pipelines so that they can divert extra water from the Bear River. And that simply can't happen. If you do that, then you've doomed the Great Salt Lake. And all of the conservation and everything that we're working on right now, if you just, divert another 200,000 acre feet of water, it's all for naught, sort of thing.
Where would that be going?
Rescind that and say that we're not going to do the Bear River Water Development Project, and we're going to live within our means, regardless of what the population growth is going to be.
Yeah, what is that project for? Is it development, or is it what's that water going to?
So the Bear River Water Development Project was approved back in the early 1990s. And so it's been on the books for a long time. And it was seen as, in the future, when we have greater population, we're going to have a greater water need. And so they wanted to be able to fit that need by diverting extra water from the Bear River. There's simply not enough. We've already over allocated the water from the rivers by 30%, and that would over allocate even further in the wrong direction. Yeah. So those are some threats to the Great Salt Lake.
The Bear River project is still it's still a possibility.
It's still moving forward. The Bear River project is still moving forward. They're currently getting easements to build pipelines from the reservoir to the different communities. So they're not actively building pipelines. They're not actively diverting, but they're putting in the infrastructure to allow them to do that in the future.
So if you had a mob of 10,000 people, is that the project you would want to stop?
It's kind of hard because we have things that we can do right now to actually put water in the lake, and that's a future threat. And so, I haven't heard legislators saying that they want to do that development anytime in the next, 10 or 15 or even 20 years, but they're looking at it like 30 or 40 years down the road. And so the question is that, if I had to take my energy and efforts, I'd try and focus on things that make a difference right now when we're closest to the tipping points, and worry about the Bear River and fight like heck later on if that starts to move forward.
You had mentioned that if there were like certain water levels, there would be kind of emergency actions that would be taken if they reach those levels. What would those emergency actions be?
Well, one of the things that you could enact is on an emergency basis, you could say that farmers all have to reduce their water usage by, say, like 15%. And the state will pay them to fallow those fields. That's a very draconian kind of emergency basis, but it would put water into the lake and help the farmers not lose economically. It's going to cost
Right.
the taxpayers of Utah, millions or billions of dollars. But if we want to save the lake and prevent, the death of the ecosystem, sometimes things like that might be necessary. But that's
Right.
not something that people are willing to talk about right now. Everything's done on a voluntary basis.
Right. Of course.
So just something else. So in my class that I'd taken, my teacher mentioned that there was a lake in California that already dried up and has been producing a bunch of dust. Do you know the name of that, and do you know about that situation?
Yeah, so that's Owens Dry Lake in California. So Owens Dry Lake is about 1/12 the size of Great Salt Lake. It basically would fit inside Farmington Bay on the Great Salt Lake.
Wow.
And Los Angeles Water and Power diverted all of the water from that stream to the drinking water in Los Angeles County. And so that lake dried up more than 100 years ago. And it turned out to be the biggest dust source in North America. And it had big human health impacts of the people that live downwind of that lake. Just to put it into perspective, the threshold for unhealthy air for PM10, which are the particles that get into your lungs, is 150 micrograms per cubic meter. The air quality at Owens Dry Lake occasionally hit 20,000.
Oh, wow.
Whoa.
You basically can't survive that for very long. So that is kind of the Armageddon sort of story. And people left, and it was the biggest dust source in North America. And then in the 1980s, the EPA had new regulations that said you have to reduce these concentrations back to healthy levels.
Yeah.
And Los Angeles didn't want to put water back in the lake. So they tried all sorts of things to try and stop the dust without putting water in. They put in snow fences to slow the wind down. They built mounds, sort of thing, kind of like moguls on skiing, to break up the wind, and then vegetated the top and did drip irrigation systems. They even crushed gravel and put it over acres and acres and acres of land. And they spent $2.5 billion with a B trying to mitigate Owens Dry Lake. And you know what they discovered? The best solution is putting water back in the lake.
Well, what do you know?
And so what did they do? They leveled big portions of the lake, and now they flood it with 2 or 3 inches of water to keep the dust down. They've done a pretty good job, but it still occasionally violates the standards for air quality. And that's just one little tiny lake compared to the Great Salt Lake. And so in my mind, mitigating the dust from Great Salt Lake is not a viable option. Yeah, you could do it, but it's going to cost tens of billions of dollars. The best solution by far is to put water back in the lake and let the water cover up the dust hotspots.
Yeah. Did you say it was Farmington Bay that had the highest concentration of hotspots?
Yes, it does. Bear River Bay and Farmington Bay are the ones that have the most dust hotspots. And those are the ones that are closest to where people live.
Of course.
So one thing that we have had brought up on the TikTok is reservoirs that are up there in the Great Salt Lake. Are those siphoning a lot of water?
So, yeah, we have reservoirs. They store water. They serve for flood control. Water also evaporates from the reservoirs, and it's just part of the water management system that we have up here. And a lot of that water is stored from the spring melt so that we can use it during the summer to water our lawns and otherwise do our industry sort of thing. So right now they've drawn down the reservoirs quite a bit in anticipation of a massive spring melt. And how much of that water makes it to the lake kind of depends upon whether or not they fill up the reservoirs first. If they do that, then we may not get as much water to the lake as we could theoretically this year.
I see.
How in contact are you, and how much do you work with like the legislature and like just public officials in general?
Yeah, so I've done testimony in front of the Clean Air Caucus, which are the legislators that are actually worried about air quality issues. And then I was part of the Great Salt Lake Strike Team, which was actually done at the request of the Speaker of the House, so Brad Wilson. And what he wanted to know is, we need to know the best science about the Great Salt Lake. We need to know, how much water we need for the lake. We need to know what the consequences are at different lake levels. And the strike team was a bunch of researchers at the University of Utah, Utah State, as well as members of the state government from the Division of Water Rights, the Division of Water Resources, Division of Environmental Quality, Division of Natural Resources as well, sort of thing. And we put together kind of a document, a report for the state legislatures that kind of summarize how we got to the shrinking lake right now and what it will take in order to get us out of it. And it also evaluated 11 different policy levers or options, including the whole thing about piping water from the ocean to show that was not where you're going to get your biggest bang for the buck. That would be the most expensive option that you could do. And it's kind of funny because I was in my class talk about the same issues with air quality. So we have our wintertime air pollution in our temperature inversions where the pollution builds up. One thing that you could do is you could build giant fans all over Salt Lake Valley. And you could turn on these fans and blow all of that pollution off to a different valley. Would it work?
Right.
Yes. Could you do it? Yes. Would it cost billions of dollars and create all sorts of potential environmental issues that we know nothing about? Absolutely. So sometimes it's easier just not to pollute in the first place, or in this case, it's easier just to conserve water in the first place.
On the topic of Utah politics, who is your least favorite Utah politician?
My favorite Utah politician was actually Representative Tim Hawks.
Your favorite?
And he's a lawyer who works for the brine shrimp industry, and he was been in the legislature for the last 5 or 6 years. He just stepped down, and he was a great advocate for the lake. Joel Ferry is a farmer. He's an alfalfa farmer who was also been a very strong advocate for the lake, and he just recently stepped down from the state legislature and is now the head of the Department of Natural Resources. And he was on the strike team, and he's been a great leader at trying to do things to save the Great Salt Lake. And I can't say enough about the leadership of the Speaker of the House, Brad Wilson. He has staked his political future on saving the Great Salt Lake. And he has publicly stated that, and he says on his watch, it will not die. And he's trying to shepherd the many different interests in the legislature to move us in a direction to where we do have an optimistic future about the Great Salt Lake.
That's awesome.
That is great.
Now, who are your least favorite Utah State politicians?
You don't have to.
Not happening.
Okay. I have a couple quick questions. What's your top 5 favorite disappearing bodies of water?
You've got the Aral Sea, which was desiccated because the country of Turkmenistan decided that they wanted to grow cotton in the desert. And they diverted almost all of the water. And the Aral Sea was the 4th largest freshwater body on the planet. Wow. It makes the Great Salt Lake look like a puddle. It was like 270 miles tall and 175 miles wide, and it was hundreds of feet deep. And it's 95% gone.
Wow.
And there was a fishing industry completely gone. There's toxic dust from there. There really is toxic dust from that one because the Russian military had all sorts of weapons facilities out there on islands, and now that stuff's blowing around now, sort of thing. So you've got that. You've got Owens Dry Lake in California, which has its own issues, but it's lessons learned. We learned that it's really expensive to mitigate dust, and the best solution is putting water back in the lake. We got the Salton Sea in Southern California, which is drying up. And that is probably the biggest dust source in North America right now. And they're still trying to figure out what to do with that. We have Lake Urmia in Iran, which is very similar to Great Salt Lake in that it's right next to very large metropolitan areas, and they've been diverting that water for cities and for agriculture in the desert, and they're suffering the same types of problems that we have here. And then, in South America, there's Lake Popo in Bolivia. There are many, many examples of this around the world, and it doesn't take a rocket scientist to understand the future of the Great Salt Lake if we don't change our behavior, because we have all of these examples to look at, ranging from things that are just now starting to dry up, like Great Salt Lake, or to things that have completely been dried up for 100 years. And we can see exactly where we're headed if we don't change what we're doing.
Wow. As a guest on the podcast, I was wondering if you could give us a quick bump it up.
Bump it up.
If you could just say bump it up for us, the Bumpy Soup
Sure.
podcast.
Bump it up.
Yeah. Let's go.
Yes, thank you. Thank you.
Kevin, thank you so much for taking an hour and a half out of your day to talk with us. I know your time is super valuable and the work you're doing is so, so important.
Yep.
Thank you.
Everybody needs to come out to the Great Salt Lake and see what we're about to lose, sort of thing. That's really what we need to do.
Yeah, maybe we'll take a trip up there and go hang out on it and have a good time while we still can.
Is it safe to taste the salt on the crust?
You know, I think it's perfectly fine, although I had one lady who reached out to me and said that she picked up some of the salt and licked it, and she instantly became paralyzed.
Wow.
And I'm like, what? And so I did some research, and there are some people that have a gene that results in temporary paralysis, and one of the triggers is exposure to salt.
Oh,
And I was
That's
totally blown
nuts.
away. I had no idea that such a thing existed. And she's like, yeah, I was paralyzed for like 10 minutes. And she wanted
That's
to know what
amazing.
toxic thing was in there that got her. And I'm like, I don't know.
Okay,
It must have been
wow.
something else.
Wow. So
Wow.
don't lick the Great Salt Lake then.
Do not lick.
Take a DNA test before you do that.
Yeah. Oh my goodness.
Where can people follow you online? Do you have social media?
Yeah, so I've got some things which are current and some which are really old. So the current one is the project that I'm working on. It's called Dust Squared, and it's like spelled out DUSTSQARED, and that's on Twitter.
Okay.
And so that talks about the project that I'm currently working on with several other researchers in northern Utah. I have a Instagram, but I haven't posted there in a long time. It's called Great Salt Lake Dust. I'll try and do something more recent with that one, sort of thing. So.
And where are like good sources of information regarding this?
Regarding dust or regarding the lake?
Like, I guess regarding like the, water levels or anything like that. Are there any sort of like,
Websites?
Yeah. So the U.S. Geological Survey has a great website with regards to the Great Salt Lake. If you want to learn more about what people can do, there's a nonprofit organization called Friends of the Great Salt Lake, which I'm a member of, which has been working to try and protect the Great Salt Lake since the mid-1990s. And it has a lot of great resources that will direct you to some of the issues as well.
great.
Thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, thank you.
Sounds
Making
good.
us feel kind of legitimate. So
We'll see if this one blows up or not, sort of thing. So,
Yeah.
hope so.
Fingers crossed.
Yeah.
yeah,
Thank you
fingers
so much
crossed.
again.
Okay.
Have a good day, and we'll talk to you later. Bye.
I liked the part where he said doo-doo.
I just like when he said
The
doo-doo.
part that he pointed it out to. He stopped his sentence, went back and said doo-doo.
Our dude said doo-doo.
And then he continued his sentence and referred to the stuff at the bottom of the lake as doo-doo. That was really good.
Yeah,
That
he
was,
doubled down on it.
Yeah.
He doubled down on the doo-doo.
Yeah.
What a cool guy. That was fun.
Yes.
What do we want to name this episode? I was thinking maybe from crust to dust.
from crust to
something.
dawn. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I the Great Salt Vape is still up there, but it doesn't
Yeah.
make a lot of sense anymore.
Yeah.
Kevin. I don't know how his name can.
Yeah.
Kevin.
Yeah.
Oh, the NFT thing was funny.
Yeah,
What
that was
that?
really good,
What was
too.
The non-functional turf or
Yeah,
terrain.
non-functional turf. Yeah.
Yeah.
NFTs suck.
Yeah.
The NFT of the real world.
Something that's
like
interesting
that.
about I guess like being a scientist and serving in that role like professionally is listening to how he talks about certain situations, right? Where there's not a lot of personal opinion he was putting in there, and it's a lot of he knows the information about this stuff and says, look, like here's the truth is it's not all scary, right? We need to
Yes.
know like
My
if we don't
mental
know any
health
info.
has improved exponentially since talking to him.
Yeah, it's just even with like when he's saying like with the Great Salt Lake, we have to find out the different levels and how
Yeah.
dangerous they are, because that's the thing. Once you know that information, we can say, yeah, we're going to need to hide inside if this keeps on going, or we can say, okay, well, we just won't have water there. Like,
Yeah.
what's the truth?
It's kind of crazy that we don't have these levels set. Like, that seems like it should just be kind of like at least known.
It's been like
and
200 years that people have been here. Yeah.
But I think that, what he was saying is that what it would imply is that there would be times when emergency action would be need to be taken. And I guess people don't want to have to deal with the fact that, like, we might actually have to implement these if these happen.
If you don't
And
take a COVID test, you never got to COVID.
Exactly.
Yeah.
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 So I feel a little bit better. I mean, like, hearing about air quality was so funny. He's like, do you think the air quality's gotten better or worse? And we're all like,
Ooh, yeah, we
worse.
got caught.
But no, we were wrong.
Well, also interesting, and this is just something with science, right? Is that, like, one of the most important parts of doing science is then telling people about it,
Yeah.
right? And
Yeah.
like, people are skeptics from the very beginning, and so like, it's telling people this information and then immediately combating people who are putting misinformation out, and
Yeah.
like him going and doing hundreds of podcasts, because you're not going to get the information
Right.
out there.
Hundreds and hundreds of
I'll get the
interviews, yeah.
information. It's only minuscule amounts of it, you know?
Yep.
It's just so cool to talk to someone who was literally boots on the ground, tire on the ground.
Tire on the ground, yeah.
Yep.
He's just on a unicycle, tire on the ground.
It's the best way to collect samples.
He's scooping them and like tossing them, and then like, this like huge tall like
Some
tower of them
Susian.
behind him.
The boots on the ground, like, actually was the one collecting the samples, doing the science on it. He's like, I don't know how I found the perfect person
Yeah.
to interview.
Yeah.
Like, the first person I found
Yeah.
online, it was him.
And someone who's
Yeah.
really involved in that stuff too,
Yeah.
right? Like, yeah.
And like he's out there doing the work of it, and we're here talking about it. And I think that it's really good that we're as important of that equation. Right? He does the doing, we do the talking. We get
Let the doers do and the talkers talk.
Yep. We get to opine about it while he gets to whine about no, never mind. I'm not gonna rhyme it.
It kind of like makes you feel bad when it's like, oh yeah, we got 200,000 views on something, and he actually knows the information. Why are we getting those views? You know what I mean?
I think that one thing that's really awesome to hear, though, that is that the companies really aren't the issue within it, right? They're actually doing they're creating a lot of like important stuff. I think that he talked about like the economic benefit and also like the mineral benefit and all that sort of stuff. But they're also like doing things to try and they benefit from having the lake available. And so the issue isn't companies so much as it is just water allocation. And it's really cool to know that there's already been work put into the agricultural sector, right? With making it no longer illegal to donate water to
You're
the Great
allowed
Salt
to
Lake.
donate now, yeah.
Yeah. And it is good to know that like he didn't quite say it out loud, but he's saying like, people should water their lawns less, be aware of that. Although that is like a small thing compared to like the larger section that is agriculture and some of these other larger areas. So, and it's really good to know that they're making those changes there. And that helps me feel a lot better. I mean, like, we need to start doing a little bit of our part, because these things are happening really in these larger quadrants.
Yeah, and I mean, like, obviously, like, individuals aren't going to make the change that fixes the Great Salt Lake or whatever, but it is really interesting to hear that there actually is an individual component where, like,
Absolutely.
with like fast fashion or things like that, like, you can't do anything. It's the companies.
Well,
but
nothing
yeah.
happens without like government putting incentives in place to like encourage that change too.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, one thing, obviously, if the government supported xeriscaping, right?
Yeah.
If they just said everyone can have xeriscaping done for free and the government will cover it,
Yeah.
Oh my
everyone would do
gosh.
it. Why wouldn't you? It's you don't have to mow your lawn, but it's the
I think the
actual
best
doing
news
it.
is that bubble baths are preserved.
Yeah.
Oh, thank God. I was so worried about that.
My
I take like
environmental
20 a
science,
day.
Professor hammered us about like, make sure you're taking like 3-minute, 5-minute showers.
Really?
You know what?
Oh, I bet you can't wait to go back
Suck
into their
it.
office and
Suck
say,
it.
yeah, you don't know
Teachers.
anything.
These liberal professors coming in here talking about bubble bath decretion.
Decretion.
Yeah. It's cool to know that he was willing to sacrifice being really cool with the Trans Am in order to help the air quality. and stuff.
Yeah.
Actually, like, it's really rad to know that there have been a bunch of these kind of like climate change based policies implemented, like switching to natural gas and decreasing coal production, that have actually helped Utah in real ways. And also that education on it has like made it feel worse, but do better.
I honestly think that's maybe a better case scenario, right?
Yeah.
Like,
Right.
being
Yeah.
a little more scared than you actually need to be instead of being
No.
like, oh, this isn't a problem
and
at
this
all.
goes along
yeah.
with the scientists getting their information out there. How do you get because if your information is, hey, be careful about this, nothing bad is going to happen, but it's not good for you, no one's going to listen.
Yeah,
right?
it's like brine flies. Like, you don't really care if the brine flies are gone,
But I care if the
but I
if the
care
whole
if I'm getting
ecology-
cancer.
Yeah.
And I think that's like one of the things, like fear mongering is obviously bad in a lot of reasons, but overall, if it helps us not give everyone in Salt Lake cancer, I would say that like that's overall probably a good
The scientists
thing.
said we could do it. The scientists said we could fearmonger.
You're a little scared, but you don't have cancer. You're welcome.
And I think that the main thing is with us knowing, yes, this is the thing that people do is fearmonger to get the right ideas. It's your responsibility as an individual to go find the information. If you hear something, you need to go look it up and find a different source of that information, and so that you can get the truth. You know,
That's why you need to do your own research on.
yeah.
Don't
Sorry,
say
no,
the
I mean,
word.
We're getting deleted
C
off of
word.
YouTube again.
I'm doing it on claws.
I think this is this was an important episode to do.
Yeah.
A little out of our normal format, but I'm glad we followed up with an expert, and I hope that I hope you listen or watch all of our episodes, but this is the one to watch if you are in Utah, probably.
I mean,
But also
anywhere.
watch the other ones too.
If you're a dumb person, you want to hear a smart person talk about smart things that dumb people ask questions about. This is the podcast.
Kevin's
this is
on
the
the pod.
place.
This is the place.
I really want to remember how he phrased that sentence of doo-doo. It was really smooth.
It was sweet.
We can watch the replay.
Yeah.
Follow us on social medias.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Bump it up.
Go ahead and get on Instagram.
Bumpy Soup on Instagram. Bumpy Soup on TikTok. Bumpy Soup on Twitter.
There's a thing somewhere.
Bumpy Soup on YouTube. We also have Good Show TM accounts. Also, Good Show TM goes on IndieFlix on tomorrow, which is
Wednesday,
March 22nd.
March.
So download those apps onto your Rokus.
Yeah. The OK Salt Lake.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry. Yeah. Okay, computer. Okay, Salt Lake.
Yeah.
Took me like 7 tries to get there.
Well, thanks everyone for watching.
Thank you so much for watching. Please go spit in the lake to help contribute to the water level.
Yeah, that will take down the salinity.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Shout out GPS.